Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're jumping right into something huge that just happened. The U.S. military strikes on June 21st, 2025, codename Midnight Hammer. They hit Iranian nuclear facilities.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high with this one.
Absolutely. So, our goal today, our mission, is really to get past the breaking news alerts and dig into this whole complex issue of Iran's nuclear program. It's controversial, to say the least.
Exactly. We want to look at where it all started, the origins, which might surprise you, and then the key sites, the tech involved, and really the decades of international worry that led up to these dramatic actions by the U.S. and Israel.
Okay, but let's ask the big question right off the bat. Why should you, listening right now, care about this? It might feel like some distant conflict, right?
That's a fair question. Look, this isn't just lines on a map or political games. It's been shaping global relationships for years. And honestly, it carries this constant risk of things getting much bigger, a wider conflict.
Which impacts everything, really. Oil prices, stability in the region.
Totally. So think of this deep dive as your shortcut. We want to get you properly informed, maybe share some surprising details, some insights you probably won't get just from the headlines. So yeah, let's get into it.
All right, so where does this story begin? You said the origins might be surprising. We're talking about a program causing so much anxiety now. How did it kick off?
Well, you have to go back to the 1950s. Believe it or not, it started quite openly. It was part of the U.S. Atoms for Peace program.
Atoms for Peace. So the U.S. was involved from the start.
Directly involved. The Shah's government, which was backed by the U.S. then, actually got a research reactor from the United States. The initial plan was all about nuclear energy. They were talking about like 20 power reactors by the 1990s.
Wow. Okay, so a completely different picture back then. What changed? The 1979 Islamic Revolution, I assume.
Absolutely. That was the pivot point. After 79, the program slowed way down. Iran became isolated internationally, but it didn't stop. By the 1980s, they started it up again, but this time with help from others, Pakistan, Russia, China.
And that shift, that's where the suspicion started to creep in.
Well, yeah, because the approach changed fundamentally. After the revolution, being cut off from the West, their big focus became self-sufficiency, doing it themselves, even if it took longer, even if it looked more suspicious. It wasn't just about energy anymore. It was about, independence. And that mindset, that really explains a lot of their defiance today.
Right. Building independence, not just reactors. And this secrecy, this self-sufficiency drive that led to alarm bells later on, early 2000s.
Exactly. By the early 2000s, Iran had quietly developed some serious uranium enrichment capabilities. Then came 2002. That was the bombshell moment. Previously unknown, undeclared facilities were discovered. Natanz and Iraq.
Undeclared. That's the key word, isn't it?
That's the key, because if they were hidden, the immediate question was, why? Suddenly, international concerns about a possible secret weapons program just exploded. Okay, so let's talk about these places. Natanz, Iraq, you mentioned Fordo earlier. What are these facilities? What do they actually do? Right, so Iran's got a whole range of sites, from mining uranium all the way to reactors. But the real nerve centers, the ones everyone focuses on, are Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan.
Let's start with Natanz. What's its role?
Natanz is the main enrichment plant. It's huge south of Tehran, thousands of centrifuges spinning away. Mostly they enrich uranium to low levels, like 3 to 5%, which is what you need for a reactor fuel.
But it could do more.
That's the critical point. It has the potential to enrich much higher, maybe even up to 90%. And 90% U-235 is weapons grade. So its sheer scale and that dual-use capability make it central.
Okay, then Fordo. You said this one is especially concerning. Why is that?
Fordo is different. Think of it as Iran's nuclear insurance policy. It's buried incredibly deep, like 300 feet under a mountain south of Tehran.
Built to survive an attack.
Pretty much. Designed to be almost immune to airstrikes. And inside, it's got more advanced centrifuges that can enrich uranium faster, and importantly, they've used it to enrich up to 20%, even higher.
And why is 20% such a big deal?
Because getting to 20% enriched uranium is, technologically, the hardest part of the journey. Once you're there, making the jump to 90% to weapons grade is significantly faster and easier. Fordo's existence, its fortification, it signaled Iran wasn't just building capability, they were planning for it to survive anything. That changes the whole game.
Got it. And the third main one is Isfahan.
Isfahan is more about research and fuel production. It handles converting uranium ore into the gas needed for the centrifuges. It's also stored highly enriched uranium there, near bomb-grade stuff. and has labs that, well, have raised concerns about weapons-related work in the past. It connects the different parts of the fuel cycle.
Are there other important sites we should know about?
Yeah, briefly. There's Arak, which has a heavy water reactor that could be a route to plutonium, another bomb fuel, though the 2015 deal aimed to limit that risk. There's Bushehr, their only operating civilian power plant, built with Russia. And of course, uranium mines like Isfahan to get the raw material out of the ground.
Okay, you mentioned enrichment and centrifuges. Can you break that down a bit more? How does that actually work? Why is it so central to all this?
Sure. So natural uranium, the stuff you dig up, is mostly an isotope called U-238. Only a tiny bit, like 0.7%, is the useful isotope, U-235, the one that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction.
So you need to increase that tiny percentage.
Exactly. Enrichment is basically sorting the U-235 from the U-238. Centrifuges are the machines that do this. They spin uranium gas at incredibly high speeds. The slightly heavier U-238 gets pushed outwards, and the lighter U-235 stays more towards the center. You repeat this process thousands of times in cascades of centrifuges.
To get different levels.
Right. For a power reactor, you need maybe 3 to 5% U-235. For a weapon, you need about 90%. And here's the really crucial part people sometimes miss. Getting from natural 0.7% up to 20% is like 80 or 90% of the total effort needed.
So reaching 20% means you're most of the way there, technologically speaking.
Precisely. The final push from 20 to 90 is much quicker. That's why Iran enriching to 20% and then even 60% later on set off so many alarms. And that's also why developing faster centrifuges, like their newer IR2 meter or IR6 models, is such a big deal. It shrinks that time needed dramatically.
Which must be why the international community got so worried, leading eventually to that big nuclear deal.
Absolutely. For years, the big fear, especially for the US, Israel, European powers, was Iran secretly developing nuclear weapons. Iran, of course, has always insisted it's purely for peaceful purposes, energy, medical research.
That fundamental clash, peace versus potential weapons.
That's the core tension. And it played out for years. Between, say, 2003 and 2015, after those facilities were revealed, you had this constant cycle. International pressure, demands for inspections, sanctions, Iran often pushing back, not fully cooperating. It was a really tense period.
A decade-long standoff, almost.
Pretty much. Felt like it was always on the edge. And that whole dynamic is what finally paved the way for the 2015 deal, the JCPOA.
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. What was that supposed to achieve? How did it work?
So the JCPOA involved Iran and the major world powers, the US, EU, Russia, China, France, Germany, UK. The basic idea was a trade-off. Iran agreed to significant limits on its nuclear program.
Like what kind of limits?
Things like capping enrichment at only 3.67%, drastically reducing its stockpile of enriched uranium, converting facilities like Fordo in Iraq to reduce proliferation risks, and crucially, allowing extensive inspections and monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
And in return?
In return, major international sanctions related to its nuclear program were lifted. So Iran got economic relief in exchange for accepting verifiable constraints on its nuclear activities. For a while, it seemed to be working, mostly.
But then it fell apart. What went wrong?
Well, the big shift came in 2018. The U.S., under President Trump, pulled out of the deal. They argued it wasn't strong enough, didn't address other issues like missiles or regional influence, and that the restrictions expired too soon.
And the U.S. reimposed sanctions.
Yes, heavy sanctions. And that basically killed the deal from Iran's perspective. They felt they weren't getting the economic benefits promised, so they started stepping back from their commitments too.
How so? What did they start doing?
Incrementally at first, but then more significantly. They started enriching uranium to higher levels, again, first past the 3.67% cap, then up to 20%, and eventually even 60%. They installed more advanced centrifuges, built up their stockpiles again, and began restricting IAEA access to some sites and data.
So by 2025, the situation was pretty dire from the perspective of non-proliferation.
Exactly. By this year, 2025, Iran had hugely expanded its enrichment capacity. IAEA monitoring was limited, and the breakout time, the estimated time needed to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one bomb, was thought to be down to maybe just weeks or a couple of months. That's why tensions were so incredibly high leading up to these strikes.
Which brings us right to June 21st, 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer. Talk us through the scale of this U.S. operation.
It was huge. We're talking 125 U.S. military aircraft. That includes 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, which are key for penetrating defenses, plus loads of support fighter jets, tankers for refueling, surveillance aircraft.
And it wasn't just air power.
No. The Navy was involved too. A U.S. submarine reportedly launched over 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles, specifically aimed at the Isfahan facility.
Okay, the timing and tactics, how did they pull this off?
The main strikes happened in a pretty tight window, between about 6:48 and 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time on June 21st. Those B-2s, they flew an incredibly long mission, something like 18 hours, all the way from the U.S.
Stealth bombers flying halfway around the world.
Right. And they used decoys, electronic warfare, and fighter escorts to basically clear the path and avoid being detected and shot down by Iran's air defenses. It required immense planning and coordination.
What about the weapons used, especially against a place like Fordo buried under mountain?
That's where the big guns came out. The B-2s dropped 14 Ju-57s, they're called MOPs, massive ordnance penetrators. Basically giant bunker buster bombs designed specifically to hit deeply buried targets like Fordo.
14 bunker busters just on Fordo.
Primarily on Fordo, yes. Across all three main sites, Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, a total of 75 precision-guided weapons were reportedly used. They clearly intended to hit these hardened facilities hard.
Okay, let's break down the targets. Fordo, how effective were those MOPs? Did they destroy it?
Well, the MOPs targeted things like ventilation shafts and access tunnels, trying to penetrate deep inside. But here's an interesting twist. Iran later confirmed they actually evacuated personnel from Fordo before the strikes hit.
Really? So they knew it was coming?
It seems likely they had warning, or at least anticipated it strongly. That minimized casualties, which is significant. As for damage, assessment is ongoing. Fordo is so hardened, it's unlikely it was completely destroyed. The goal was probably more about making it unusable, collapsing tunnels, destroying equipment inside, setting them back significantly. But guaranteed destruction? Probably not.
What about Natanz? It had already been hit by Israel, right?
Yes, Israel had hit parts of Natanz before. The U.S. strikes, again with B-2s, focused on the underground enrichment halls. Satellite imagery afterwards apparently showed craters and signs of damage, possibly affecting power or the centrifuges themselves. It looks like a coordinated effort to keep hitting it.
And Isfahan, hit by both missiles and earlier Israeli strikes.
Correct. U.S. Tomahawk missiles hit Isfahan after Israel had already targeted some of its above-ground buildings and labs. But the big question mark hanging over Isfahan, and maybe Natanz too, is the stockpile.
The enriched uranium.
Exactly. Did Iran manage to move its stockpile of highly enriched uranium before the strikes? We don't know for sure. If they did, that obviously lessens the impact of hitting the storage areas. That's a major uncertainty.
So President Trump called it a spectacular military success, but it sounds like U.S. officials are a bit more measured.
They are. While the White House projected success, military officials, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, were more cautious in public statements. They stressed that a full battle damage assessment takes time. They acknowledged the uncertainty about the stockpile location and, crucially, the possibility that Iran might have other secret facilities we don't even know about.
So claiming total destruction might be premature.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Significant damage, yes, almost certainly. A fatal blow. Much harder to say right now.
How did Iran officially react? We know they evacuated Fordo.
Their state media confirmed attacks on all three sites. They condemned it, called it a dangerous war started by the U.S., and they immediately vowed retaliation.
Which we've seen with missile attacks aimed at Israel.
Yes, including using missiles like the Khyber Shikan. They hit targets in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. Iran also publicly rejected diplomacy, saying they wouldn't negotiate while under attack. So, condemnation, vow of revenge, rejection of talks.
Okay, so bottom line, what's the immediate impact on Iran's nuclear capability? Has this operation effectively ended their path to a bomb, even temporarily?
It's almost certainly caused a significant delay. Destroying centrifuges, damaging facilities, disrupting operations, that all pushes their timeline back. But how much? Experts suggest Iran might still be able to reach breakout capacity, enough material for one bomb within months, not years if they're absolutely determined.
Especially if they have hidden stockpiles or facilities.
Exactly. Those unknowns are key. The IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, has said there's no sign of radiological fallout, which is good news, but their access is still limited, making it hard to verify exactly what's left and what Iran might do next. So, setback, yes. Program ended. Very unlikely.
And what about the political fallout, domestically in the U.S. and internationally?
Well, President Trump made the announcement himself, first on Truth Social, then in a televised address. He was flanked by his VP, J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, Defense Secretary Hegseth. He issued strong warnings to Iran, but specifically said it wasn't about regime change.
Trying to limit the scope, perhaps.
Possibly. But there was immediate pushback. Some Democrats criticize launching strikes without getting explicit approval from Congress. And internationally, China was quick to condemn the strikes, calling them a violation of international law. That signals a clear diplomatic rift.
Right. And it's crucial, as you said, to see this not in isolation, but as part of this escalating Iran-Israel conflict in 2025. The U.S. strikes didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. Israel had already been conducting its own strikes against Iranian nuclear and military targets throughout June. They reportedly hit Natanz's above-ground plant, struck Fordo in Isfahan around June 13th.
And even more strikes on the same day as the U.S. operation.
Yes, reports indicate Israeli jets hit other targets in Isfahan and Yazd on June 21st, apparently linked to the killing of Iranian military figures and scientists earlier. It really looks like a sustained, possibly coordinated campaign.
And Iran's response has been direct retaliation against Israel.
Very direct. Multiple waves of missile and drone attacks. That strike in Ramat Aviv, Tel Aviv, caused serious destruction. Iran's foreign minister doubling down, canceling planned talks in Oman. It's a clear tit-for-tat escalation spiral.
Which raises fears of a wider war. What are the ripple effects in the region?
Huge concern. The U.S. has around 20 military bases scattered across the Middle East. They're all potential targets now for Iranian retaliation. Iran has the missiles, the drones, even things like fast boats for swarm attacks against ships.
How are others reacting on the ground?
It's interesting. Markets in Tel Aviv actually rallied briefly on the news of the U.S. strikes, maybe hoping it would force an end to the conflict. Meanwhile, the U.S. started preparing to evacuate non-essential staff from its embassy in Baghdad, fearing instability or attacks there. So very real, immediate consequences.
Okay, this leads us inevitably to the big question everyone's asking. Is World War III a real possibility here? What factors are pushing us closer?
Look, it's a scary thought, and there are definite risk factors. First, Iran's retaliation options. If they hit U.S. bases directly or escalate massively against Israel, that could trigger a much larger U.S. response.
And allies get drawn in.
Exactly. Israel relies heavily on U.S. support. Iran has ties, albeit complex ones, with Russia and China. China condemning the U.S. strikes is a signal. If they or Russia were to offer more direct support to Iran, that escalates things dramatically. Then there's the nuclear dimension itself. If Iran feels its existence is threatened, could it make a final dash for a bomb or even use one if they had it? And finally, just the global context.
You mean existing tensions?
Yeah. U.S.-Russia tensions over Ukraine, NATO, China's ambitions in Asia. The world is already pretty tense. A major conflict in the Middle East could ignite sparks elsewhere through miscalculation or opportunism.
That sounds pretty grim. Are there factors pulling us back from the brink, things that might mitigate the risk?
Thankfully, yes. First, the U.S. has stated limits, emphasizing infrastructure targets, not regime change, not civilians. That might be an attempt to keep things contained. Second, international pressure. China, while condemning the U.S., is also calling for ceasefire and dialogue along with others. Nobody really wants a global conflict.
And Iran's actions, evacuating Fordo.
That's a key point. Evacuating personnel beforehand suggests Iran might want to absorb the hit without being forced into an all-out war that could be devastating for them. They might prefer asymmetric responses or hitting back at Israel rather than taking on the U.S. directly. And don't forget economics.
The global economy couldn't handle it.
A world war would crater global markets, disrupt trade massively. All major powers have a huge incentive to avoid that kind of catastrophe.
So pulling it all together, what's the assessment? How close are we?
Right now, what we have is a very dangerous, high-stakes regional war, mainly between Iran and Israel, with the U.S. now directly involved militarily against Iran's nuclear sites. Is World War III inevitable? No, absolutely not. It currently lacks that direct great power versus great power confrontation.
But it's not impossible.
It's not impossible. It would likely require a series of major escalations or miscalculations, like Iran hitting U.S. forces directly and causing mass casualties, or Russia-China stepping in militarily. The probability today, still relatively low, I'd say, but it's definitely not zero. The risk of stumbling into something bigger is real. The situation is incredibly volatile.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. From atoms for peace, way back when, through decades of suspicion, technical advances, diplomatic efforts like the JCPOA, its collapse, and now these major military strikes.
It really highlights this incredibly delicate, dangerous balance between national ambition, regional rivalries, and the global fear of nuclear proliferation.
Absolutely. Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given Iran's resilience and determination and the clear red lines drawn by Israel and the U.S., what does success even look like in this conflict going forward? How might that definition change? And what new kinds of deterrence or maybe even new paths for diplomacy could possibly emerge from this incredibly tense situation?
Something definitely worth thinking about.
We hope this deep dive gave you some valuable context and insights. Thanks for joining us.